This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com in review. What I'm looking at today is 2014's Girlhouse. This movie has a very cinematic look to it. I wouldn't have guessed it was 2014 at all. In fact, I thought it was current. And the plot revolves quite a bit around technology, phones, computers, that type of thing. So it fits in a modern context, which really surprises me. And I got that 2014 date from IMDb, and I'm wondering if it's accurate. This movie looks really current. It's a very crisp looking, a very interesting movie, cinematography-wise, and just image-wise. It's very nice looking. It also begins in a very interesting fashion. It starts off with these two girls who are chasing after this kind of overweight kid, and he gets terrorized by them. They set in motion a spiral that affects his entire life from that point onward. And in a better movie, this would be an interesting character study about how monsters are created, not born. Though, in this instance, it's a great opening that rapidly kind of gets silly. But the thing is, it's silly in the sense of slasher movies. In fact, this harkens back to Friday the 13th, the original Halloween, and oddly enough, Tourist Trap. The killer in this movie wears a mask very reminiscent of Chuck Connor's in that movie. Girl's House refers to, it's a sex line, as in pornography. And it's a protected house, no one knows where it is, and it's there so that these girls they're filmed doing whatever. So our antagonist works at Girlhouse, and she uses the money to pay for her schooling. And one of the people who watches the proceedings is the guy who killed the girl in the introduction. And as you might expect from movies of this nature, his life is pretty much gone to shit. He's like a deviant. He creeps around, just very kind of an icky dude. And as I implied earlier, the movie could have actually made a very profound statement about monsters, human monsters, and what makes a person like that. The movie very much abandons any responsibility for that storyline whatsoever and becomes a very routine slasher flick. Though it's probably among some of the better ones in the sense that the killer isn't a Superman. And the way he kills people is oftentimes, it's not overly creative, which is nice, because then it gets kind of silly. But at the same time, what makes it work is that he will surprise you and kill you. And he uses this technique to attack people who are significantly bigger than he is oftentimes. And that makes sense. If you're going to do that type of thing, most movies would just have you go after someone with a knife. And if the person is significantly larger than you, they're going to shove that knife up your ass. Let's be honest. So the idea that he surprises a lot of his larger opponents makes sense. He'll just rush at you, and before you even understand what's happening, he's stabbing you. So it's a logical approach. What's weaker still is the idea that you have electronic devices controlling other electronic devices. I'll give you what I mean. In this movie, the person who's in charge of Girlhouse has a phone where he can cut off other people's phones, he can lock down the house, he can open doors, all from this telephone, which also makes it feel modern. But at the same time, how do you do that? Some of that stuff is science fiction-y at best. Now keep in mind something. There is software made to manage, let's say you work in a business. There's one called, I believe, Jamf, Jamf, and it's used to manage iOS devices. So you could have your phone, if it's being managed by Jamf, let's say it could be wiped. It can be locked if you lose it. So you can manage portable devices. But what was happening in this movie is not that. The person was doing all sorts of things that you probably wouldn't have that much control over. And I mentioned iOS earlier. There's also Android. So whatever the application that phone was running, it would have to interact with both iOS and Android devices. Though, admittedly, I only saw iPhones in a movie, but it's still, the principle doesn't make any sense. It's more science fiction than fact. So that was a bit irritating because it wasn't really necessary. If the movie had been a little more clever, you could have worked out ways that the killer would be able to do what they were doing without a magic phone. Though when all is said and done, Girlhouse is not a great movie. It's barely good, in fact, but it's entertaining, it looks great, it's interesting, and you have to keep in mind that most slasher films are not particularly good in the sense of being very well told stories. Halloween was so minimalist, there's barely a story to tell. It's a great movie, by the way, though there's not a lot to it. Friday the 13th, which I think in some ways is a better movie, nonetheless, the story's it's not the strongest suit. And so having weak stories is not unusual for this genre. Though, if the story weren't quite so contrived, such as in the ways I've already mentioned, the idea of the electronic devices that can do virtually anything, the idea of the killer and his story just being kind of empty, then Girlhouse could have been one of the best. Unfortunately, it's not, and it's worth a watch. It's enjoyable, it's interesting, but not nearly as good as it perhaps could be. This is Brian with ScreenFiles.com and Review. Peace.